So you'd be forgiven if you looked at the images that you see on your screen right now and you think I'm showing you footage from a war zone. These images look very similar to the aftermath of the firebombing of Tokyo during World War II, or maybe Hiroshima or Nagasaki or Dresden. But in reality, what you're looking at is the results of Mamdani-style policies being implemented right here in New York City. What you're looking at is the aftermath of the famous Bronx 70s fires that ripped apart the South Bronx, and almost all of these fires, even though at the time they were attributed to vagrants and the community itself, were set for insurance fraud purposes. And this is because rent control and stabilization rules were so strict in the city of New York that owning an apartment building, which should be one of the most profitable things that you could do in the city of New York, was such a bad investment that many landlords felt like they had no choice but to burn it down for the insurance. And a bunch of the people had built lives, a family, community in the South Bronx ended up being relocated to projects due to the fact that these disastrous policies that allegedly were put in place to help poor people like this ended up backfiring immensely. And this is what we're on the cusp of doing right now in this moment in the city of New York with the election of Zohran Mamdani. And I've seen a lot of people talk about Mamdani in all these different various sorts of ways, but very few people go after this man directly on his number one issue, which is affordability, because his policies are the one thing that has been absolutely proven to fail in that regard. And this is what we're going to talk about today. But before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
I've already told you about my commitment to freeze the rent for every single rent-stabilized tenant. That covers about half of all New York City renters.
So Zohran Mamdani has been running his entire campaign basically on the Freeze the Rent platform. And this refers to a rent freeze that he promises to implement if he assumes the office of New York City mayor, which is very likely. And it applies to the 44% of New York City apartments that are currently covered under the rent stabilization program. Now, of course, with rents skyrocketing in the city of New York, I feel like people need to ask this question more often than it gets asked, which is, if 44% of apartments are covered under the rent stabilization program, how come if this policy works, rents are so high as compared to the rest of the country? And in fact, how come cities that are known for similar type programs or have more units under their control also experience ridiculously high rents? And examples that come to mind are Los Angeles, California, which has about 60% of their apartments under a rent stabilization program, or San Francisco, which has 2/3 about of their apartments, again, under a similar system. Again, if these programs ended up working, if they didn't end up backfiring, should we not see these cities on the list of the most affordable each and every year rather than the least affordable? But again, nobody asked that question. But of course, we're here to ask it, we're here to answer it, and I'm here to explain exactly why rent stabilization is the fastest way to exploding home prices, exploding rental prices.
Thank you. And a follow-up for you, Mr. Mamdani. The cost of maintaining a building change year to year for landlords. The Rent Guidelines Board is legally required to consider those costs when deciding whether to freeze rents. So how can you promise a rent freeze today before ever seeing that data next year?
You know, we've seen the data time and again. It's
next year's data.
It's been data that's been overruled by mayors again and again. The last Rent Guidelines Board study showed that profits were up 12% for landlords of those units. And what did they do? They raised the rent, adding to more than 12% under Eric Adams' administration.
So Mamdani has attacked Mayor Eric Adams repeatedly for allowing rent to go up, for overruling his rent stabilization board allegedly, and passing on massive rental increases to residents in these stabilized apartments. And in other venues, he has said that rent stabilized apartments should be stabilized. That's the whole point of the program. But very few people actually bring up how much Mayor Eric Adams ended up raising the rent in these stabilized apartments, because what you ultimately end up finding out when you look into it is that his rent stabilization board didn't even raise the rent enough to cover inflation. They didn't even raise the rent enough to cover past rent freezes under the previous administration, the de Blasio administration, because the average rent increase for Eric Adams is about 3% a year in the rent stabilization program. And by the way, if you guys are not aware, the default under the rent stabilization program, if the board does nothing, is 1.5% for 1-year leases and 2.5% for 2-year leases. So what Zohran Mamdani is complaining about is these rent stabilized units getting a 3% increase for 1-year leases and a 4.5% increase for 2-year leases, which again, during the period of time that we're talking about, which is 2021 through 2024, is lower than the rate of inflation and is not keeping up at all whatsoever with building costs. And again, is part of the reason why we're seeing so many rent stabilized units end up being taken off the market, because the program has distorted the market so much that you actually lose more money renting it than leaving it vacant.
All right, this building right here is the 8th of nearly 100,000 vacant apartments that are in New York City. This is 2nd Avenue, which is prime real estate, where the average 4-bedroom goes for $6,000. I'll show you another completely vacant building about 200 feet away. Now, why are all these buildings vacant? These apartments continue to sit vacant because of a law that was passed in 2019 called the Housing and Stability Tenant Protection Act. Very well intentioned, very poorly executed. Big picture, what the law did is when someone moves out of a rent stabilized apartment, let's say they want to move to Florida or they pass away, they eliminated the landlord's ability to raise the rent at a reasonable level. So now when someone moves out of a building, the landlord's like, it doesn't make economic sense to renovate the apartment, and they take the tax rate off and let that apartment sit vacant. Here's another completely vacant building. Look at that. That building's been vacant for over 5 years, so you can read all about it. So every single day, as these apartments are being moved out of and they are not being renovated, New York City becomes more and more unaffordable.
Again, a perfect example is this video right here, where you have an individual on TikTok describing the empty building phenomenon in New York City while rents are sky high. Now, for whatever reason, he decides to give you the average price of a 4-bedroom apartment there, saying it's $6,000. I think it would be more honest to talk about the average for a 1-bedroom, which would be maybe $3,000 to $5,000 in that particular area. But the thing that he doesn't tell you is that the particular building that he highlighted for you doesn't get to charge $3,000. It doesn't even get to charge $2,000. It doesn't even get to charge $500 a month for rent. That building is locked in under the rent control regime at $350, as I pointed out to you guys out there in the audience multiple different times. And there is no way in hell that you are going to be able to operate an apartment at anything but a dramatic loss if you can only charge a tenant $350 to stay there. It just doesn't make sense. It's distortionary. And the fact is, these apartments are being yanked off the market faster than ever due to the fact that the rental increases don't cover the cost of operating the building. But to make matters worse, Andrew Cuomo, the other guy, decided that he was going to respond to the progressive wave that brought people like Mamdani into office at the State House and State Senate by signing in even more absurd protections, quote unquote, for tenants.
The agreement is a huge blow to New York's real estate industry and considered a victory for tenants. The new legislation would essentially eliminate the deregulation of rent-stabilized apartments, as well as the ability to significantly hike the rent when a tenant moves out. It also lowers the amount a landlord could hike the rent for building improvements. There's also new protections for all tenants, such as limiting security deposit to 1 month's rent, making unlawful eviction a Class A misdemeanor, eliminating blacklists for rental agencies, and protection against retaliatory evictions.
We've been fighting for 2 decades for some of the laws that will be in the bill.
And while Governor Cuomo has pledged to sign whatever bill eventually makes its way to his desk,
I believe it is a step forward. This is the best bill they can pass. So I will sign it.
So in 2019, during the first progressive wave to the New York State House and New York State Senate, Governor Andrew Cuomo made a horrible mistake for New Yorkers by signing what was described as a historic tenant protection law, but in reality, it was something that further doomed the city of New York to higher rental prices because it closed an alleged loophole that landlords were using to raise rent in rent-stabilized apartments by basically removing the exemption of you being able to charge more, have your rent reset not to the market rate, but to the stabilization rate if you actually improved your building, if you actually brought it up to code. And what's insane about this law is that it didn't even exempt buildings that were already mid-renovation. So we ended up in a situation in the city of New York where a bunch of landlords that were working to improve their units, bring them up to code, halted construction immediately, and we ended up with crazy scenarios like this building in Manhattan where the landlord stopped paying his mortgage and then he sued the bank to force them to foreclose on the property, but then the bank sued him so that he could keep the property even though he wasn't paying on it because the property was such a losing asset for either party to hold.
There's a game of hot potato going on in Harlem with this building. The owner of this building can't pay the mortgage, the rents don't cover the cost to operate, so they stopped paying, and the bank started a foreclosure. That's when the owner said, take it, and the bank said, whoa, we don't want it, the building is losing money and there's no way to fix it. So now they're literally suing each other over who gets stuck with the building. What's even crazier, this is the second bank dealing with this problem. The first one collapsed because it owned this building and many others like it. How many other buildings? Thousands.
Now, for years, we saw the negative impacts of this in reports that, again, when you saw them individually, you might have not thought they were connected. But of course, when you add them up in their totality, you can realize what was going on. For instance, a couple of years after that law was passed, there was talk about how 13,000 newly vacated rent-stabilized apartments were being held off the market due to the fact that it just did not make any sense to rent them because you can't get the adjustment after a tenant had eventually moved out. Now, that particular report highlights about 13,000 new rent-stabilized units that, again, were moved off the market, but there are estimates that say that there are tens of thousands, somewhere in the range of 60,000 apartments that are deliberately being held off the market due to the fact that if they were to be rented, they would be rented at a loss. And in addition to that, if the tenant stopped paying that already unprofitable rent.
Rent-stabilized apartments are highly sought after in New York City, but the number of those available for renting is the subject of a just-released report from the nonpartisan New York City Independent Budget Office. The IBO says that more than 13,000 apartments sat vacant for at least 2 years between 2021 and 2022.
Owners don't want those apartments to sit vacant. It makes no sense. A vacant apartment helps nobody.
Frank Ricci, executive vice president of the Rent Stabilization Association, says from their perspective, a number of vacancies are the result of changes to the law in 2019 that restrict rent increases for stabilized units, especially if significant repairs are needed to make an apartment habitable.
And it could be anywhere from $40,000 to $100,000, depending on the size of the apartment. But under the current law, the owner is only allowed an $89 a month increase. So let's say you have a $700 a month apartment, you have to put in $50,000 to get $89 a month back. Your rate of return is going to be 30 or 40 years.
And in addition to that, the extra tenant protections that were in that 2019 package and subsequent laws that were passed in New York City by progressive government there actually make it really difficult to evict a tenant. So even if you're scraping by, just breaking even on these rent stabilized units, the moment they stop paying, you are in for a 2-year legal battle, again, over an asset that is not even making you money in the first place. Now, simultaneously, we were also seeing reports of the average rent in Manhattan, again, at a time where New York City's population was decreasing, surging to over $5,000 for a one-bedroom apartment.
According to a report by Douglas Elliman, a one-bedroom reached a record average of $5,058 in June, up even more in July to $5,113. That's $1,000 more than a year ago.
I've never seen these prices, and also the desperation for people to really find somewhere to live.
Melinda Sakari with Douglas Elliman says she expected once pandemic discounts were over, tenants wouldn't be able to afford rent and move, but many, despite massive increases, stayed. This as workers returned to the city, and for the last 8 months, the vacancy rate dropped under 2%. Add to the mix lack of new builds.
Nothing has been built for the last 3 years.
Now, again, it just does not make any sense for these two things to exist, but for the fact that we have these progressive policies, again, again, in the direction of rent control and rent stabilization. Apartments in the market are getting so expensive that they're over $5,000 per one-bedroom apartment, and yet you have tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000 available apartment units, or could be available apartment units, that are removed from the market in the very same areas because guess what? They're just so unprofitable due to government policy. And the thing is, Mamdani has no solution for this. While he's promising to build more affordable housing, which we've talked about on this channel, how that is going to blow up in terms of costs, because anytime the government builds anything, it gets extraordinarily more expensive. He is not proposing a rent freeze for the people that are paying market rates. The rent freeze only applies to people in the stabilization program. And while market rent in Manhattan is well over $5,000 for a one-bedroom apartment, the rent stabilized rent, what Mamdani wants to keep down, is less than half of that at $2,160. And again, this is not a one-to-one comparison because that $2,160 applies to all rent stabilized apartments in Manhattan, not just the one-bedroom apartment. So what Mamdani is trying to do is get the freeze in for the people paying the $2,160 rather than the people that are paying the over $5,000. But the thing is that as more units get pulled off the market, you are constricting supply, so that market rate for rent is going to go up. And of course, more units will be pulled off the market if they continuously freeze the rent, is making the buildings unmanageable.
And for the record, what is your monthly rent or mortgage, Mr. Sliwa?
About $3,900. It's not subsidized there. So,
Mr. Mamdani, what is your monthly rent or mortgage?
$2,300.
Mr. Cuomo.
He has a rent-stabilized apartment that a poor person's supposed to have. Mine is about $7,800.
Okay.
Now, you guys might think to yourself, well, Sean, you know what? The rent freeze is supposed to help the poors. It's supposed to help the brokies, the middle class stay in the city of New York. But the fact of the matter is, the rent stabilization program, at least the old buildings, the ones that are the most cheap and affordable, does not check for income. It doesn't verify income. New buildings that are closer to market rent, but are actually put into the stabilization program, those do income verification, but after a certain amount of time, they actually fall off of that requirement, and you could rent it to whoever you want as long as you follow the rent stabilization guidelines in terms of pricing. This is why Zohran Mamdani himself is paying $2,300 in Astoria, because he, even though he's the child of a multimillionaire, his wife is the child of an even richer person, and he makes over $180,000 as a New York State Assembly person, is paying significantly below market rate in order to live in Astoria. Again, the average market apartment that is a one-bedroom, and we don't know right now whether or not Mamdani has a one- or two-bedroom apartment, is $2,800 to $3,200 in that neighborhood. And considering Mamdani lives in a nicer part of Astoria, it's probably even higher than that. If it's a two-bedroom, we're talking easily $3,500, but Zohran Mamdani is getting a $1,300 discount to live in this area potentially, even though again, he could definitely afford to pay the market rent. And this is not an accident, because the thing is, once these apartments are available for everyone, the landlord has a line of people around the block trying to rent them. So if you're a landlord and you exist in the context of New York City, who are you going to rent to? Somebody who obviously has the highest income, the highest net worth, and is the most likely to pay their rent, because if you rent to somebody who is in the income range where they can just afford this apartment, guess what? That's going to lead to a situation where they're one job loss or one emergency away from not paying rent. And if you get into an eviction battle with them, that's a 2-year-long process. So we have a system where under rent stabilization, the most affordable apartments are actually going to the wealthiest people because they're not requiring any kind of income verification. And again, it just stands to reason that if you're a landlord, you want to have a tenant that is most likely going to pay you your rent on time, especially if that rent is set in and around your break-even point and you can't afford any kind of missed payment, otherwise the building will go under. In addition to that, the rent stabilization and rent control regime actually incentivize people who would normally leave their apartments, maybe when their kids move out or something of the sort, to hold on to apartments for longer periods of time because it's considered an asset for you because the rent is so low and there's no incentive for you to put units back on the market, which is is why New York City is suffering from devastatingly low inventory. Because again, if your rent is locked in, you essentially hold that apartment forever, and then the normal fluctuations of people moving in and out, allowing supply to become available, don't actually occur. And by the way, I need to make this 100% clear to everybody out there in the audience, even though we're not going to touch on this too much. We don't have to live like this. You look at charts of where rent is falling, and one of the things you see right at the top of the list is the city of Austin, which has rent down nearly 20% since 2023, while population has gone up. And this is because Austin ended up addressing their zoning code, which was already very lax compared to New York City, to allow more building. And guess what? When you increase supply in response to demand, prices stabilize or go down. 25 minutes by car from New York City in Westchester County, they did the same exact thing. And while New York City rents are exploding, again, 25-minute drive away, over in New Rochelle, rents are falling, and they've been falling by 2% a year since 2020. So while Mamdani is complaining about rent stabilized increases that don't even touch the rate of inflation, New Rochelle has built themselves to the point where their market is so competitive that rents are actually falling. So we know the solution, we know what works, but Mamdani's program explicitly says that he is going to block private developments that don't represent his values. Now look, I don't know if we're going to get to the era of the insurance fires again in the city of New York under Mamdani, but when you look at the number of units that are being pulled off the market each and every year, the number of buildings that are on the cusp of becoming insolvent due to the fact that they can't respond to market conditions and their maintenance costs are getting worse over time as these buildings age, I would not be surprised if we started to see fires perk up during the Mamdani administration, because he plans to make everything worse with every action that he's going to take in this particular area. But guess what? The landlords don't even have to set these buildings on fire for the insurance money for the fires to return to areas like the Bronx. As was reported earlier this year, the increase in fires in the buildings that weren't burned back in the day are often attributed to problems that haven't been addressed due to the fact that there has been a lack of maintenance, due to the fact that the rent control and stabilization regime is not actually supporting the landlord's ability to do that maintenance. So we have crumbling buildings all over that could unintentionally catch on fire under the Mamdani administration. It's already been happening under the Adams administration, and nothing proposed is actually going to incentivize the landlords to fix up their property, and many of them just can't do it. So it's a ticking time bomb right now. And in fact, Vicky Palladino actually warned about this back in 2019 when the previous scheme was debated, that essentially they're playing whack-a-mole, where they end up passing a law that creates problems, and then they pass new laws to address those problems, but they end up creating more things, and it only gets worse, and it starts to accelerate.
In a few more years, we'll all sit here again and wonder why housing is even more expensive and try to pass yet another dumb solution destined to fail this city.
And that prophecy has been fulfilled since 2019, and guess what? It has real, genuine impacts. And at this point in time, I think it would behoove me to tell you guys something that I discovered during the research process for this particular video. Because one of the things that I know from my mother's side of the family is that when she was a girl, she was actually made homeless due to the fact that supposedly a drug addict set a fire in the tenement that she lived in New York City. Now, I did not know at the time whether or not my mom lived in the South Bronx. And in fact, when I contacted her and her sister, what I found out is that they did not, in fact, live in the South Bronx. They lived in the Bushwick neighborhood. And Bushwick right now is one of the most gentrified areas. It's one of the strongest supporting areas for Zohran Mamdani. But back in the day, Bushwick was another area that experienced an extraordinary amount of fires in the 1970s. In fact, from 70 to 75, there were 4,000 apartment fires in this particular area. And again, there's a famous Bushwick fire that happened in 1977. And again, much of these fires were set due to the fact that rent control was keeping prices to the point where they were unprofitable. And after talking to my aunt and getting her memory of these events, even though she was a child, I was absolutely heartbroken because my aunt, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my mom, they were all in the building when the fire broke out. They had to run through a flame-laden doorway in order to escape, and they were homeless and forced to move from a regular apartment in Brooklyn, New York, in Bushwick, to the projects because they were without a home. And my aunt ended up telling me that she remembered having to go into the building after the fire was put out and pick out clothes from the building in order to get dressed to go to school. And when she got to school, the other kids made fun of her because she smelled like smoke and, of course, wet wood due to the fact that there was just a fire that incinerated her whole life at that moment in time. And again, this fire that nearly killed the entirety of my mother's family was set very likely for insurance fraud purposes. Don't think the irony is lost on me that the neighborhood that my mother was burned out of, forced into homelessness along with so many others, and then into the projects, is Bushwick, Brooklyn. Because if you go to Bushwick, Brooklyn right now, guess what? There's a bunch of Mamdani supporters there. It's one of his strongholds. You have the very people in that area that spend their days going to frozen yogurt shops, sprinkling a little bit of cereal on it, paying $25 for it, and complaining about gentrification, voting for the policies that represent the gasoline that set the working class Bushwick on fire back in the day so they could have it to themselves. Again, absolute madness in every possible way, but expected, sensible, logical, because that's how they got there in the first place, so there's no reason they wouldn't double down. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think about all this down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Mamdani's disaster. Till next time.